Marcus Brennan sat at his kitchen table at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, staring at papers that could take his daughter away. The discharge documents from Pinewood Elementary lay beside an envelope bearing the seal of Child Protective Services. His hands, calloused from 15 years of construction work, trembled as they rested on the table's worn surface. On the wall above hung a photograph he'd salvaged from his father's belongings after the funeral, a young Marine in dress blues, 1967, 3 months before shipping to Vietnam. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of highway traffic. Marcus's eyes moved from the CPS notice to his father's photograph and back again. The words blurred together: concerns about father's ability to provide stable environment, an association with potentially dangerous organization, and disruption of school environment necessitating welfare investigation. He'd failed the mission his father had taught him. A Marine protects those who can't protect themselves. For 3 months, Lily had been suffering, and he'd convinced himself to trust the system, to believe the teachers and administrators who told him everything was fine, that he was overreacting, that single fathers sometimes struggled to understand modern educational standards. The memory came unbidden, as it often did in the darkest hours. He was 12 years old, standing in the garage while his father worked on a Harley-Davidson that had carried him through the Mekong Delta. The older man's hands moved with practiced precision, adjusting the carburetor, checking the timing. His father had looked up, grease-stained fingers still working. "Son, this bike saved my life in Vietnam. Not because it was fast, because my brothers rode beside me. You understand what I'm telling you?" Marcus had shaken his head. "You never abandon your own. When things get hard, when you're scared, that's when you find out what you're made of. Fear is just your body telling you this moment matters. Question is, do you run or do you stand? What if I'm not strong enough?" His father had smiled then, a rare expression. "That's why you don't stand alone. That's what brothers are for." Marcus stood now, moving to the window that overlooked the parking lot. His pickup truck sat beneath a streetlight, and beside it his own Harley, a Road King. He'd rebuilt himself, learning from YouTube videos and memories of his father's lessons. The bike was a connection to a man who died when Marcus was 15, leaving behind a son who'd spent the next 28 years trying to live up to lessons learned in a garage. The CPS investigation was scheduled for tomorrow at 2. He could lose Lily not because he'd failed as a father, but because he'd dared to challenge a system that protected itself. The school board member who'd filed the report had done it the same day Marcus had witnessed the abuse, before the bikers had even arrived. It was preemptive warfare, discrediting the whistleblower before he could speak. Marcus returned to the table and opened a different folder. Inside were drawings, Lily's artwork from the past 3 months, organized chronologically. August, when first grade began, bright colors, smiling stick figures labeled "Me and Daddy," rainbows arcing across construction paper, a sun with rays extending to the edges. September, the colors had faded to grays and browns, figures smaller. No smiles, just the word "school," written in shaky letters. October, dark crayons scribbled over the entire page, a tiny figure in one corner. Other figures pointing at her, black covering what might have been something beautiful underneath. He hadn't found these immediately. They'd been hidden under Lily's bed, stuffed behind her toy box, where she thought he wouldn't look. She'd been screaming in silence for months while he'd trusted principals and teachers in a system that had learned to gaslight parents with surgical precision. The question that kept him awake wasn't whether he'd done the right thing by pulling her from that classroom. It was why he'd waited so long, why he'd let his own self-doubt override his instincts, why he'd been so afraid of being labeled an overprotective single dad that he'd left his daughter in hell for 90 days. 3 months earlier, none of this had seemed possible. August had arrived with the promise of new beginnings. Lily had turned 6 in July, and first grade felt like a milestone worth celebrating. Marcus had taken the morning off work, something his foreman allowed only for genuine emergencies or major family events. He'd made pancakes from scratch, Lily's favorite, and she'd stood on the step stool beside the stove, chattering about everything she'd learned in Mrs. Hayes' class. The other mothers at kindergarten pickup had talked about Hayes with reverence. 20 years of experience, they'd said. High standards, really prepares kids for second grade. A little strict but fair. Their children would be lucky to have her. Marcus had felt the familiar flutter of inadequacy that accompanied so many parenting decisions. He was doing this alone had been since Sarah walked out when Lily was 2. The addiction had won, and Sarah had chosen it over both of them. He'd never told Lily the full truth, only that her mother had been sick and couldn't stay. The same way his own father had explained his mother's departure when Marcus was barely old enough to understand. Single fathers raising daughters, it was a legacy he'd inherited, and he'd spent 6 years determined to do it better than good enough. That August morning, he'd struggled with Lily's hair, attempting a French braid he'd learned from a YouTube tutorial. 3 attempts, each one slightly better than the last, until finally something resembling the photographs appeared. Lily had examined herself in the bathroom mirror with solemn concentration. "Do I look pretty, Daddy?" "You look beautiful, sweetheart. You always do." She turned and hugged him with the fierce intensity only a 6-year-old could muster. Marcus had knelt, returning the embrace, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo. These moments were gold-proof that despite everything, despite Sarah leaving, despite his fears of inadequacy, despite the judgments he felt from other parents, he was doing something right. He'd packed her lunchbox with care, turkey sandwich on whole wheat apple slices, carrot sticks, a juice box, and a note on a yellow sticky note that read, "You're brave, you're smart, I love you, Dad." He did this every single day, a ritual inherited from his father, who'd left similar notes in Marcus's lunchbox throughout elementary school. After his father died, Marcus had found them all saved in a shoebox in the garage, dozens of reminders that he'd been loved. The drive to Pinewood Elementary took 12 minutes. Lily had sat in the booster seat, her new backpack clutched in her lap like a shield. Other children bounced out of their parents' cars, excited to see friends running toward the building with the boundless energy of youth. Lily had moved more slowly, watching them, with something between anticipation and apprehension. Marcus had caught her hand before she could unbuckle. "Hey, you know I love you more than anything in this world, right?" She'd nodded, but her eyes had stayed on the school building. "First grade is going to be great. And if anything feels wrong, if anyone makes you uncomfortable, you tell me." "Promise." "I promise, Daddy." She'd leaned over to hug him, and Marcus had held on perhaps a moment too long, that parental instinct whispering warnings he couldn't quite articulate. Inside the school, the hallways had buzzed with the controlled chaos of the first day. Parents shepherded children toward classrooms, while teachers stood at doorways with welcoming smiles and name tags. Room 112 was at the end of the main corridor, and Mrs. Victoria Hayes stood at its entrance with the posture of someone accustomed to authority. She was 47, though Marcus wouldn't learn her exact age until much later. Her hair was pulled back severely, her cardigan pressed, her slacks creased with military precision. The classroom walls behind her were covered in behavior charts, test score graphs, achievement awards, spanning 2 decades. This was a teacher who took education seriously, who had credentials and experience and results. Mrs. Hayes had looked at Marcus with an expression he'd seen too many times, that microsecond assessment that took in his work boots, his calloused hands, the fading tattoos visible beneath rolled sleeves, the leather jacket draped over his arm. Her smile had remained professional, but something had shifted in her eyes. "Mr. Brennan, I presume Lily's father." "Yes, ma'am. Pleased to meet you." "I assume Lily lives primarily with her mother." The question had landed like a subtle jab, delivered with such casual politeness that challenging it would seem defensive. "No, ma'am, just me. Her mother's not in the picture." Hayes had nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something. "I see. Well, first grade requires consistency, Mr. Brennan. It's a significant step up from kindergarten. Structure and routine are essential." The implication hung unspoken. Single father equals inconsistent equals child who might struggle with structure. Marcus had felt the familiar tightness in his chest, but had forced a smile. "Lily's a great kid, smart, eager to learn. I think she'll do well. Of course, though, I find it's often the transition that proves challenging. We'll see how she adjusts." He'd left feeling unsettled, a sensation he tried to dismiss as first-day jitters. Hayes was experienced, respected, credentialed. He was a construction worker who'd learned parenting from the internet. Who was he to question her methods? That first week had seemed manageable. Lily came home each afternoon quiet but not obviously distressed. When asked about her day, she'd offered brief responses. "Fine. Okay. We learned about addition." The enthusiasm from that morning pancake breakfast had dimmed, but Marcus attributed it to adjustment exactly as Hayes had predicted. By week 2, the changes became harder to ignore. Lily stopped mentioning friends. The drawings that had once covered their refrigerator ceased appearing. She no longer asked to invite classmates over for playdates. Her lunchbox came home with food uneaten, the yellow sticky notes crumpled at the bottom. Marcus had asked if everything was all right at school. Lily had nodded, but her eyes hadn't met his. "Is Mrs. Hayes nice to you?" "She's very strict, but everyone says that's good." "Do you like her?" Lily had hesitated, a pause that should have been his first real alarm. "She wants us to be smart. She says first grade is serious." The third week brought symptoms Marcus couldn't rationalize. Lily woke him at 2 in the morning crying, her sheets soaked. She hadn't wet the bed since she was 3, and the shame on her face broke his heart. "I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm so sorry." He'd stripped the sheets without comment, running a bath while she stood trembling in the hallway. "Accidents happen, sweetheart. It's not your fault. You're okay." But she wasn't okay. The next night, she had nightmares, waking screaming at 4 in the morning. Marcus had rushed to her room to find her sitting upright, eyes open but unseeing, repeating words that chilled him. "I'll try harder. I promise I'll try harder. Please." He'd held her until she fully woke, disoriented and terrified. "Lily, what were you dreaming about?" "School. Mrs. Hayes was mad at me." "Why was she mad?" "I got the answer wrong. I always get the answer wrong." Marcus had spent the rest of the night in her room, sitting in the chair beside her bed, watching her sleep fitfully. In the morning, he'd called his friend Tommy from the construction crew, a father of 3. Tommy's voice had been grim over the phone. "Marcus, that sounds like more than adjustment stress. My niece had bedwetting issues when her stepdad was—" "Look, I'm not saying it's that, but something's wrong. Kids don't regress like this for no reason. The teacher says she's adjusting. The school counselor says some children take longer to adapt to structure." "And what does your gut tell you?" Marcus had looked at Lily eating breakfast in slow motion, her usual appetite gone, dark circles under her eyes. His gut told him his daughter was suffering. But he was a single father who worked construction, and they were educated professionals who did this for a living. Who was he to trust his instincts over their expertise? The fourth week introduced behaviors that terrified him. Lily began apologizing for everything. She dropped a crayon, "Sorry, Daddy." She asked for help reaching something on a high shelf. "Sorry for bothering you." She spoke during dinner. "Sorry, am I talking too much?" The excessive apologizing triggered something deep in Marcus's memory. He'd seen this before in his own childhood, watching a classmate whose father berated him constantly. The boy had developed the same reflex, apologizing for existing, for taking up space, for having needs. Marcus had tried to address it gently. "Lily, you don't need to apologize for asking me for help. That's what I'm here for. You're never bothering me." "Mrs. Hayes says I bother her too much. She says I should figure things out myself." "What kinds of things?" Lily had looked down at her plate. "Like reading and math and writing neatly. I'm not good at anything." The words had struck like a physical blow. His daughter, who'd been so confident just a month earlier, now believed herself fundamentally inadequate. "Sweetheart, you're 6 years old. You're still learning. That's what first grade is for." "Mrs. Hayes says first graders should already know these things. She says kindergarten should have taught me better." Marcus had wanted to drive to the school that instant, but the clock read 8:30 at night. Instead, he'd composed an email to Mrs. Hayes, keeping his tone respectful, concerned, collaborative. "Mrs. Hayes, I'm noticing some concerning changes in Lily's behavior and self-esteem. She seems very anxious about school and is making negative statements about her abilities. Could we schedule a time to discuss her progress and any strategies I might implement at home to support her learning?" The response had arrived 12 hours later, time to look thoughtful rather than defensive. "Mr. Brennan, Lily is performing at grade level academically. First grade represents a significant increase in expectations compared to kindergarten. Some children struggle with this transition, particularly those from less structured home environments. I'm happy to discuss strategies for implementing more structure at home if you'd find that helpful. I have an opening Friday at 4:30 for a parent-teacher conference." The phrase "less structured home environments" was code. Marcus understood that. Single parent, working class, Probably doesn't have dinner at the same time every night or enforce consistent bedtime routines. The implication was clear. The problem wasn't Hayes's teaching, it was Marcus's parenting. He'd responded immediately, accepting the meeting time, though rage had coiled in his chest as he typed. The fifth week brought escalation. Lily had been eating dinner when Marcus reached across the table for the salt shaker. She'd flinched, actually recoiled, as if expecting him to strike her. He'd frozen, hands suspended midair, watching his daughter's involuntary fear response to his simple movement. Lily, I was just getting the salt. I would never hurt you. You know that, right? She'd nodded, but the flinch had been instinctive, trained into her by something he couldn't see. Sunday nights became a special torture. Lily would develop stomach aches, complaining of nausea and cramps that had no physical cause, but were nonetheless real. She'd cry sometimes for hours, begging not to have to go to school tomorrow. Marcus had held her helpless, watching the clock tick toward Monday morning and the return to whatever was happening in room 112. He tried everything he could think of within the system's bounds. He'd scheduled an appointment with Dr. Chen, their pediatrician. The examination had revealed no physical issues, no medical explanation for the bedwetting or the stomach aches or the appetite loss. Dr. Chen had asked gentle questions about the home environment. Has anything changed recently? Any new partners? Any increased stress at work? Sometimes children internalize parental anxiety. Nothing's changed except she started first grade. And how is school going? Her teacher says she's doing fine academically, but Lily seems miserable. Chen had nodded with professional sympathy. First grade can be a difficult transition. Some children are more sensitive than others. Has Lily always been anxious? No, she was confident, happy. This is new. Sometimes developmental stages bring out different aspects of personality. I'd recommend keeping a close eye on her emotional state. If it doesn't improve in a few weeks, we might consider a referral to a child psychologist. Marcus had left feeling dismissed, as if Lily's suffering was a developmental quirk rather than a response to something concrete. The school counselor, Ms. Rodriguez, had been equally unhelpful. She'd met with Marcus in a small office decorated with motivational posters about growth mindsets and overcoming challenges. Mr. Brennan, first grade is a significant adjustment. Some children need more time to adapt to increased structure and higher expectations. But she's terrified. She's having nightmares. She's wetting the bed again. Ms. Rodriguez had tilted her head sympathetically. Has there been any trauma at home? Sometimes children act out to get attention from busy parents. I'm not suggesting that's the case, but it's something to consider. The implication had been unmistakable. You're a single working father. Maybe you're not meeting her emotional needs. I'm present in her life. I make breakfast, pack her lunches, help with homework, read to her every night. I'm there. Of course, I'm sure you're doing your best, but sometimes our best isn't quite enough, and that's okay. It's hard being a single parent. Marcus had felt the conversation shift, watched himself being subtly repositioned from concerned father to potential problem. Every question turned back towards what was happening at home, as if school were beyond examination. He'd left that meeting with dawning understanding that the system was designed to protect itself. Acknowledge a problem with a teacher, and you open the door to complaints, investigations, liability. Much easier to suggest the child was struggling with home issues or developmental adjustment. By week 6, Lily had stopped drawing entirely. Marcus had set out her art supplies one evening, encouraging her to create something. She'd looked at the blank paper with something approaching dread. I don't want to draw anymore. Why not, sweetheart? You love drawing. I'm bad at it. Mrs. Hayes says my drawings are messy. She says I need to stay inside the lines. Marcus had picked up one of her old drawings from August, the one with the rainbow and the sun. This is beautiful. Art isn't about staying inside lines. It's about expressing yourself. Expression is for people who are good at things. The phrase had been too sophisticated, too precise for a 6-year-old to have conceived independently. She was parroting something she'd heard, internalizing an adult's judgment as immutable truth. Week 7 brought the moment Marcus should have recognized as a breaking point. They'd been working on homework, simple addition problems. Lily had struggled with a problem, erasing her answer multiple times, her hands shaking as she wrote, "Daddy, what's 5 plus 4? You can figure it out, sweetheart. Use your fingers if it helps." She'd counted on her fingers, slowly, carefully arrived at 9 and written it down. Then she'd stared at it with mounting panic. Is it right? Did I do it right? Yes, that's correct. Good job. Are you sure? Because if it's wrong, I'm stupid. The word had detonated in Marcus's chest. Don't ever call yourself that. You're not stupid. You're 6 years old and you're learning. But Mrs. Hayes says I'm stupid. She asked me if I was stupid or lazy. Marcus had gone very still. She said that to you. Those exact words. Lily had nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. In front of everyone. She asked if I was really that stupid or if I was just not trying, and I said I was trying, and she said trying wasn't good enough if I'm still stupid. He'd pulled her into his arms, feeling her small body shake with sobs. Rage had filled him then, pure and clarifying, but he'd kept his voice calm. Lily, listen to me. Mrs. Hayes is wrong. You are not stupid. You are smart and kind and creative. She should never have said that to you. Do you understand that's not how teachers should talk to students? But she's the teacher. She knows. She doesn't know everything, and she's wrong about you. That night, after Lily had finally fallen asleep, Marcus had paced his apartment, fury and helplessness warring in his chest. He drafted an email demanding an immediate meeting, then deleted it and started again, forcing professional language while his hands trembled on the keyboard. The conference was scheduled for Friday. He would address this then. He would be calm, rational, solution-focused. He would trust the system one more time. Friday had arrived with the weight of accumulated dread. Marcus had left work early, changed into clean clothes, a flannel shirt and jeans, trying to look respectable while remaining himself. He'd driven to Pinewood Elementary with his jaw clenched, rehearsing what he'd say, how he'd address concerns without seeming accusatory or unstable. The conference had been scheduled for 4:30 after most students had left. Room 112 was quiet when Marcus entered, only Mrs. Hayes present, sitting behind her desk with files arranged before her. She gestured to a student chair on the opposite side of the desk, a subtle power play that put Marcus physically below her eye level. He'd remained standing. Hayes had looked up, surprise flickering across her face before settling back into professional composure. Mr. Brennan, thank you for coming. Please sit. I'll stand, thanks. Mrs. Hayes, I need to talk about what's happening with Lily. Of course. As I mentioned in my email, Lily is performing adequately in academic areas, though she does require additional support in, Marcus had interrupted, unable to maintain the careful politeness he'd rehearsed. She's having nightmares. She's wetting the bed. She thinks she's stupid. She comes home from school terrified, and she won't tell me what's happening because she's afraid it will get worse. Hayes had folded her hands on the desk, her expression shifting to something that resembled concern but felt calculated. Mr. Brennan, with all due respect, those sound like home issues. Has something changed in your household? Nothing's changed, except she started first grade. In my experience, children from single-parent households often struggle with consistency. The structure required in first grade can be challenging when home life lacks similar organization. The dig had been expertly delivered, wrapped in educational jargon and professional concern. Marcus had felt his control slipping. My household is structured. I make her meals, help with homework, maintain bedtime routines. I'm present in her life. What happens in this classroom? Hayes had leaned back and Marcus had recognized the shift. She was done pretending concern. Mr. Brennan, I have 22 students. I cannot provide individual coddling to each child. First grade requires independence, resilience, the ability to handle correction without falling apart. Lily is emotionally fragile. She cries when corrected. She requires excessive reassurance. She doesn't follow instructions the first time. She's 6 years old. She's in first grade, which means she should be developing age-appropriate coping mechanisms. In my 20 years of teaching, I've found that children who struggle emotionally often have issues at home that manifest as school difficulties. You're blaming a 6-year-old for being scared of you. Hayes' expression had hardened. I'm noting that your daughter lacks the emotional regulation necessary for this grade level. Perhaps if you focused less on being her friend and more on being her parent, she'd be better prepared for real-world expectations. Marcus had taken a step forward, and Hayes' hand had moved to something beneath her desk. Later, he'd realized it was a panic button connected to the principal's office. At the time, he'd only felt the fury of watching someone blame his daughter for being abused. You're telling me it's Lily's fault she's terrified. My fault she comes home thinking she's worthless. Mr. Brennan, I'm going to need you to calm down. I am calm. His voice had been low-controlled, more frightening than shouting. I'm also done with this conversation. The door had opened before he could turn. Principal Dr. Patricia Monroe had entered with the practiced ease of someone who'd been listening on an intercom. Is there a problem here? Hayes had straightened her voice, taking on a tremor that hadn't been present seconds earlier. Dr. Monroe, Mr. Brennan became aggressive when I tried to discuss Lily's emotional difficulties. I felt threatened. Marcus had stared at her, watching the performance unfold. She'd baited him into anger, pushed him to the edge, and now was reframing his controlled frustration as threatening behavior. Monroe had positioned herself between Marcus and Hayes, a physical barrier that suggested protection was necessary. Mr. Brennan, I understand you're upset, but shouting at staff is unacceptable. I didn't shout. Mrs. Hayes feels threatened. We take staff safety very seriously. Marcus had understood then. This was documentation. This meeting had been planned from the moment he'd requested it. They'd anticipated his anger, had prepared to discredit him, to create a paper trail that painted him as an unstable parent rather than a legitimate complainant. This is a setup. Monroe's expression had remained professionally sympathetic. Mr. Brennan, we're all concerned about Lily's welfare. If there are stressors at home affecting her adjustment, we have resources available. Perhaps a referral to social services. You're threatening to call CPS on me. We're mandatory reporters. If we have concerns about a child's home environment, the problem isn't my home. The problem is what happens in this classroom. Hayes had stood, her voice strengthening now that Monroe was present. Dr. Monroe, perhaps we should document this interaction. Mr. Brennan's aggressive behavior, his refusal to acknowledge Lily's issues, his association with, she'd paused, letting the silence carry weight. I've seen the motorcycle in the parking lot, the patches on his jacket. We should consider whether Lily's home environment is appropriate. The trap had sprung fully closed. They weren't just dismissing his complaints. They were positioning him as the problem, setting the stage for retaliation if he pushed further. Marcus had looked between them, these two women who were supposed to protect children, and had recognized the system for what it was: self-protective, impermeable, more interested in avoiding liability than admitting fault. He'd walked out without another word, knowing anything he said would be used against him. In the hallway, his hands had been shaking, rage and helplessness churning in his gut. He'd driven home in silence, mind racing through options that all seemed to dead end at the same conclusion: they held all the power, and he had none. That night, Lily had asked if everything was okay with school. Marcus had forced a smile and lied, telling her he'd spoken to her teacher and everything would be better. But as he'd tucked her in, watching her face relax into uneasy sleep, he'd made a private vow. If they wouldn't protect her, he would, whatever it took. October 15th had arrived with the particular dread of inevitability. Marcus had woken Lily at 7 as always, and had found her staring at the ceiling, her eyes already filled with tears. I don't want to go. I know, sweetheart, but you have to. Please, Daddy, please don't make me. She'd thrown her arms around his neck, and Marcus had held her while she sobbed, feeling each cry like a knife wound. This wasn't the anxious tears of a child who didn't want to do homework or face a test. This was primal fear, the desperate plea of someone being sent back to the place that hurt them. He dressed her in silence, made breakfast she couldn't eat, packed a lunch she wouldn't touch. In the truck, she'd sat motionless, staring out the window, her small hands clenched in her lap. Lily, if something bad is happening, if Mrs. Hayes is hurting you, you can tell me. I'll fix it. I promise I'll fix it. She'd looked at him with eyes too old for her face. You can't fix it, Daddy. You already tried. She said you tried to make trouble, and now I'm going to have to try even harder so she doesn't stay mad. The words had confirmed everything. Hayes had retaliated after the conference had taken out her anger on Lily, had made the child responsible for her father's advocacy. This was why children stayed silent. This was how systems perpetuated abuse. Marcus had pulled into the drop-off line, and Lily had unbuckled with the resignation of someone walking to execution. He'd caught her hand. I love you. You know that, right? More than anything in this world. I love you too, Daddy. She'd walked into the building, her backpack seeming to weigh her down, her shoulders hunched, her feet dragging. Marcus had watched until she disappeared through the doors, and then he'd made a decision. He'd called his foreman. "Tommy, I need a personal day. Family emergency. Everything okay?" "No, but it will be." He'd driven home, changed into a clean shirt that didn't have the club logo, and sat in his living room for 3 hours watching the clock. At 11:30, he had left for the bakery, purchasing chocolate chip cookies, Lily's favorite. The plan was simple: surprise visit, bring treats, take her to lunch, and observe. Just watch. Trust his eyes rather than their words. The drive back to Pinewood Elementary had taken 12 minutes, and with each passing moment, Marcus's anxiety had grown. He'd parked in the visitor lot at 11:45, grabbed the bakery box, and walked through the front doors. The receptionist, Mrs. Lynn, had looked up with a welcoming smile. "Oh, Mr. Brennan, surprising Lily for lunch. Thought she'd like a treat. Is that okay?" "Of course, room 112 down the hall and to the left." Such a sweet father. He'd thanked her and moved through the hallways, past bulletin boards covered in student artwork, past classrooms where teachers read aloud and children sang songs about the days of the week. Everything had seemed normal, safe, exactly like a place where children should thrive. His anxiety had begun to ease, the voice of doubt, whispering that maybe he really was overreacting. Maybe Lily was just sensitive. Maybe he'd been seeing problems where only adjustment existed. Then he'd heard the voice, sharp, cold, cutting through the ambient noise of the school like a blade through flesh. It had come from room 112, and Marcus had stopped walking, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. He'd approached slowly, not wanting to disrupt if this was merely stern teaching. Through the rectangular window in the door, he'd been able to see the entire classroom. 22 children sat at desks in neat rows. Hayes stood at the front of the room, and in front of her, small and trembling, stood Lily. His daughter's body language had told him everything before he had heard a single word. Shoulders hunched inward, head bowed, hands twisting together at her waist. She'd been trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. Hayes's voice had carried clearly through the cracked door. "Are you really this stupid, or are you just not trying?" Marcus's vision had narrowed, tunnel vision, fixing on his daughter's face. Tears had been streaming down Lily's cheeks, her mouth opening and closing without sound. "Do you see anyone else in this classroom struggling with something this simple? Do you?" Lily's whispered response had been barely audible. "I'm trying, Mrs. Hayes. Trying. A kindergartner could do this problem. You're in first grade. What does that tell you about yourself?" The other children had been frozen, some staring at their desks, some watching with the horrified fascination of witnesses to a car crash. None had looked surprised. This wasn't unusual. This was routine. Hayes had leaned down, her face level with Lily's, and her voice had dropped to something more intimate, more personal, more cruel. "I asked you a question. Are you stupid or are you lazy? Which one is it?" Lily's small voice: "I'm sorry, I'm trying, I just don't understand." Don't understand? A 6-year-old should understand this. Unless Hayes had straightened, addressing the class while Lily stood exposed. Unless that 6-year-old isn't as smart as other 6-year-olds. Unless that 6-year-old is holding everyone else back. Marcus's hands had clenched into fists, the bakery box crumpling under pressure. Every muscle in his body had tensed, his jaw locked so tight he'd tasted blood where he'd bitten his inner cheek. He'd seen men try to intimidate opponents in bar fights, had watched bullies operate in every environment imaginable, but this, an adult woman systematically destroying a child's spirit with words designed to humiliate, this was cruelty of a different order. Hayes had gestured broadly at the other students. "Do you see how you're wasting everyone's time? Do you see how your classmates have to wait because you can't do something basic?" Lily had begun crying openly now. Not the loud wailing of a child seeking comfort, but the silent, hopeless crying of someone who'd learned that begging made things worse. "Stop crying. Crying doesn't fix stupid. Crying is what babies do, and you're supposed to be in first grade." Marcus had moved then, his hand on the door handle, but he'd forced himself to wait to witness fully, to understand the complete scope of what had been happening to his daughter for 3 months. Hayes had pointed at Lily's desk. "Sit down. We'll try again tomorrow. Though I'm sure you'll waste everyone's time then too. Maybe if you cared half as much about learning as you do about—" The words had died mid-sentence because Hayes had looked up and seen him. Marcus had stood in the doorway, 6'3" of controlled fury, his eyes locked on the woman who'd been destroying his daughter. The silence that had followed had been absolute. 22 children holding their breath. Hayes's expression shifting from sneering contempt to shock to fear to a desperate attempt at professional composure. But it had been too late. He'd heard everything. He'd seen everything. And the look on his face had told her she'd made a catastrophic mistake. Marcus hadn't moved, hadn't spoken, had simply stood there, his presence filling the doorway. Hayes's hands had betrayed her, trembling slightly as she'd smoothed her cardigan, her mouth opening and closing as she'd searched for words that could explain away what he'd witnessed. Lily had turned and seen him, and her face had transformed, relief flooding her features, followed immediately by confusion and fear. Not fear of him, but fear of what would happen now, fear that standing up would make things worse, fear that had been trained into her over 90 days of systematic abuse. Marcus had walked past the rows of silent children, his boots making soft sounds against the linoleum, and had knelt beside his daughter. His hands, so much larger than hers, had rested gently on her shoulders. "Get your backpack, sweetheart. We're leaving." Lily had moved immediately, scrambling to her desk with urgency that told him this wasn't the first time she'd wanted to escape this room. Her small hands had fumbled with the zipper, shoving papers and pencils inside with shaking fingers. Hayes had found her voice, though it had come out higher than before, strained with false authority. "Mr. Brennan, you cannot just, this is highly inappropriate. We're in the middle of a lesson. If you have concerns." Marcus had stood slowly, his full height seeming to fill the room. He still hadn't looked at Hayes, his eyes remaining on Lily, who'd gotten her backpack on and was looking up at him with an expression that broke his heart. Only then had he turned his gaze to Hayes. He hadn't yelled, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made threats. He'd simply looked at her with eyes that had seen hard things in life, eyes that could read people down to their core, eyes that held complete understanding of exactly who she was and what she'd been doing. The silence had lasted perhaps 5 seconds, but it had felt eternal. Hayes's face had gone pale, her mouth had opened and closed, and Marcus had seen guilt flicker across her expression. She'd known she'd been caught. He'd turned without a word and walked Lily toward the door, his hand holding hers. Behind them, Hayes's voice had risen, defensive now, talking faster. "I was correcting her behavior. This is taken completely out of context. You don't understand the full situation. These children need structure and discipline." Marcus had kept walking. Lily had taken quick steps to match his stride, but she hadn't complained, hadn't asked questions. She just held tight to his hand like it was the only solid thing in her world. They'd moved down the hallway, past the cheerful bulletin boards, past the singing classrooms, and Lily had looked up at him with confusion and relief warring on her small face. She hadn't understood what was happening, but she'd understood one thing with absolute certainty: she was safe now. Her daddy had come, her daddy had seen, and everything was going to be different. Marcus had pushed through the front office door, with Lily still at his side. Mrs. Lynn had looked up, surprised to see them leaving so soon. "Oh, leaving already? Did you—" "I need to speak to the principal. Now, please." Something in his voice had made Mrs. Lynn reach for her phone, immediately buzzing Dr. Monroe's office without the usual pleasantries. The door marked Dr. Patricia Monroe, principal, had opened within seconds, and the woman herself had appeared with her practiced smile. "Mr. Brennan, is everything all right? I understand there was some kind of— Can we speak privately inside?" Monroe had glanced at Lily. Marcus had knelt, making himself eye level with his daughter. "Sweetheart, I need you to sit right here for a few minutes, okay? I'm going to talk to Dr. Monroe and then we're going home. You're safe, I promise." Lily had nodded and sat in the chair outside the office, clutching her backpack to her chest. Marcus had watched her for a moment, making sure she was settled, then had turned back to the principal. Inside Monroe's office, surrounded by framed certificates and motivational posters about learning and growth, Marcus had remained standing rather than accepting the seat offered. He'd kept his voice level, factual, controlled, but the fury beneath had been unmistakable. He described exactly what he'd witnessed, the tone Hayes had used, the specific words, the way Lily had flinched, the other children's reactions, that suggested this was routine. He hadn't embellished, hadn't needed to. The facts had been damning enough. Monroe had listened with an expression of concern that Marcus had immediately recognized as performative. When he'd finished, she'd folded her hands on her desk and given him a smile meant to be reassuring, but that had come across as patronizing. Mr. Brennan, I understand you're upset. Any parent would be, but I think there may be some misunderstanding here. Mrs. Hayes is one of our most experienced teachers. She has high standards, yes, and she can be firm. But that's because she wants the best for her students. Sometimes children perceive correction as criticism when it's really just, I know what I saw, that wasn't correction, that was verbal abuse. Monroe's smile had tightened. I think those are very strong words, Mr. Brennan. You witnessed a brief moment taken out of context. Classroom management can look harsh to someone not familiar with educational techniques. Marcus had felt the same pattern emerging, the same gaslighting script. Mrs. Hayes called my daughter stupid. She asked her in front of the entire class if she was stupid or lazy. She told her a kindergartner could do what she couldn't. She made her feel worthless. Monroe had sighed, a sound heavy with patience for the unreasonable. I'm sure it felt that way to you, but teachers sometimes use challenging language to motivate students. It's possible Mrs. Hayes's approach was a bit more direct than ideal, and I can certainly speak with her about her tone, but this sounds like a miscommunication rather than anything malicious. How many other parents have complained about Mrs. Hayes? The question had landed harder than Marcus had expected. Monroe's expression had frozen for half a second, a micro-expression of recognition before the professional mask had slid back into place. I can't discuss other families with you, Mr. Brennan. That would be inappropriate. So there are other families, multiple complaints. I didn't say that. You didn't deny it either. Monroe had stood, her professional demeanor cracking slightly into defensiveness. Mr. Brennan, I think you're overreacting. Mrs. Hayes has the highest test scores in our district. Her students consistently perform above grade level. If you would just calm down and think rationally about this. Marcus had straightened to his full height. I am calm. I'm also done with this conversation. I'm withdrawing Lily from this school effective immediately. I'll be filing a formal complaint with the district. And if I find out that other parents have complained about Mrs. Hayes and been ignored, there will be consequences. Monroe had moved around her desk, her voice taking on an edge. Mr. Brennan, threats are not. That's not a threat. It's a promise. Children were hurt. You knew. You did nothing. That ends today. He turned and walked out, letting the door close firmly behind him. Lily had jumped up from her chair the moment she'd seen him, and he'd knelt down again, meeting her at eye level. His hands had rested on her shoulders, and he'd looked into her eyes with absolute certainty. You're never going back to that classroom. Never. Do you understand me? Lily's eyes had filled with tears, but these had been different release, the breaking of a dam that had been holding back 3 months of accumulated terror. She'd thrown her arms around his neck and held on tight. Marcus had wrapped her in his arms and stood lifting her easily. She'd been getting too big to carry, but right now she needed to feel small and protected and safe. He'd held her close as he'd walked out of that building past Mrs. Lynn, who'd been pretending to be busy with paperwork, through the glass doors and into the October sunlight. He'd strapped Lily into the passenger seat of his truck, made sure she was secure, then had climbed into the driver's seat. For a long moment, he'd sat there, hands on the steering wheel, jaw-tight, mind racing through everything that needed to happen next. Lily had watched him with those big, trusting eyes. Are you mad at me, Daddy? Marcus's chest had constricted. Never. I'm mad at people who hurt you. There's a big difference. What's going to happen now? Now we're going to make sure you're safe, and we're going to make sure no other kids get hurt the way you were. He'd pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he'd found the name he needed. Jake Rivera, road name goes president of their chapter of the Hells Angels. They'd been brothers for 15 years since Marcus had prospected after his father died, and he'd needed something to fill the void. Ghost had stood beside him through the divorce, had held Lily when she'd been 2 weeks old, had been more family than many blood relatives. The phone had rung twice before a gravelly voice had answered. Iron Shield, what's up, brother? Marcus had looked at Lily, who'd been watching him with absolute trust, and had felt something settle in his chest, something hard and immovable and certain. I need the club. Someone hurt my little girl, and I need everyone to know that's not acceptable. There had been a pause on the other end, not hesitation, but calculation, Ghost's mind already working through what this meant and what would be required. Where and when? Pinewood Elementary, within the hour. Consider it done, brother. Iron Shield, we got you. We got Lily. The call had ended and Marcus had sat in the school parking lot engine, idling, watching the building where his daughter had suffered for 90 days. Within the hour, Ghost would make calls, and those calls would spread through the Brotherhood like wildfire. Within the hour, 200 men would drop everything and ride to this location. Within the hour, the school administration would understand something fundamental. You could dismiss one parent, you could gaslight one father, but you couldn't ignore 200 bikers who refused to leave until someone answered for what they'd done. Marcus had driven Lily to Rosa's house, Bulldog's wife, one of the few people he trusted completely with his daughter. Rosa had taken one look at Lily's tear-stained face and had swept her into a hug without questions. She'd suggested they bake cookies together, and Lily had agreed quietly, her small hand slipping into Rosa's. Marcus had knelt one more time, making sure Lily could see his face. I have to go take care of something. But you're safe here. Rosa's going to stay with you, and I'll be back soon, I promise. Lily had looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much fear for someone so young. Are you coming back, promise? Always, no matter what. That's a promise I'll never break. She'd hugged him and Marcus had held on perhaps a moment too long before releasing her to Rosa's care. As he'd driven away, his mind had already shifted to what came next. He'd tried the system's way conferences emails, trusting that professionals knew better than a construction worker who'd learned parenting from YouTube. The system had failed, had protected itself, and the abuser had tried to make him the problem. Time for a different approach. At 3:45, Marcus had pulled into the Pinewood Elementary parking lot for the second time that day. The lot had been mostly empty, just a few cars belonging to teachers staying late. He'd parked his pickup in the far corner and had sat waiting, watching the school building, thinking about his father's lessons about duty and protection, and refusing to abandon those who needed you. At 3:47, the first bike had arrived. Ghost's black road glide had pulled into the lot, the engine's rumble announcing presence and purpose. Ghost had killed the engine, dismounted, and had taken position facing the school building, arms crossed, stance wide, not aggressive, but absolutely immovable. At 3:52, 5 more bikes had appeared, riding in formation, their engines synchronized with the practiced precision that came from years of riding together. They'd parked in a neat row beside Ghost's bike, and the riders had dismounted with military efficiency, each taking position beside their machine. By 4 o'clock, 20 bikes had filled the parking lot, and the sound had shifted from individual engines to a collective presence, a bass note you felt in your chest as much as heard with your ears. Teachers had begun appearing at windows faces, pressed to glass, trying to understand what was happening. Marcus had climbed out of his truck and had walked to where Ghost stood. They hadn't needed words. Ghost had placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a brief acknowledgement of brotherhood and solidarity, and Marcus had nodded his understanding and gratitude. More bikes had arrived in waves, 3, then 5, then 8 at a time. By 4:15, motorcycles had filled the lot, their riders standing in silent formation. By 4:30, the number had reached 100, and the rumble of approaching engines had suggested many more were coming. Principal Monroe had emerged from the building, her face pale, and had approached the nearest police officer, a school resource officer who'd appeared at some point in the growing assembly. Marcus had watched her gesture, had seen the officer speak into his radio, had recognized the moment she'd understood this wasn't something she could simply dismiss or explain away. By 4:45, 150 bikes had surrounded the school. The riders ranged in age from 30s to 70s, wearing patches that told stories of military service and brotherhood and lives lived by codes older than these systems that had failed these children. They stood silent, patient, not threatening, but absolutely refusing to be ignored. By 5 o'clock, 200 motorcycles filled every available space in the parking lot, spilled onto the street, lined the block. 200 men stood in solidarity, and the message was unmistakable. One father's complaint could be dismissed. This could not be. Marcus stood with his brothers, watching the sun begin its descent toward the horizon, and thought about the phone call he'd make tonight to check on Lily, the CPS investigation scheduled for tomorrow, the battles that remained to be fought. But for now, in this moment, surrounded by men who'd answered his call without question, He felt something he hadn't felt in months, not alone. His father had taught him that fear was your body telling you a moment mattered, and the question was whether you'd run or stand. Marcus had stood, his brothers had stood with him, and before the sun set on this October day, the school would understand what his daughter should have known all along. Adults would protect her, systems would be held accountable, and silence would no longer shield those who hurt children. The first news van pulled into the lot at 4:55, its satellite dish extending toward the sky. A reporter and cameraman climbed out immediately, recognizing the scale of what was unfolding. Within minutes, two more vans arrived, cameras beginning to roll, capturing the rows of motorcycles, the silent bikers, the school building behind them, and the growing crowd of parents who'd begun to arrive, drawn by the spectacle and staying once they'd learned why these men had come. Marcus stood at the front of the assembly, Ghost beside him, and waited for someone from the school to emerge and answer for what had been done. The brotherhood had arrived. The witnesses were assembled. And whatever happened next, his daughter would know when she'd needed him most. Her father had refused to look away. The rumble of engines had become a living thing, rolling across the parking lot in waves as more brothers answered the call. Marcus watched bike after bike pull into formation, each rider dismounting with practiced efficiency, each taking position beside his machine. The coordination spoke to something deeper than casual friendship. This was military discipline translated to civilian life veterans who understood that sometimes the most powerful action was simply refusing to move. Daniel Patterson arrived at 5:03, still wearing hospital scrubs under his riding jacket. Doc, they called him, and the road name fit. He'd spent 30 years as an Army medic before retiring to emergency room nursing, and his hands had saved more lives than most people would meet. He was 58 now, gray threading through his beard, but his eyes still carried the sharp focus of someone trained to assess trauma in seconds. Doc parked his bike in the growing formation and walked directly to Marcus. They clasped forearms in the brotherhood greeting, and Doc's grip was firm, steady, certain. Ghost told me what happened. How's Lily? Safe, at Rose's. Scared, but safe. Doc's jaw had tightened. My niece, 15 years ago, teacher in Ohio. Similar situation. We didn't have backup then. School destroyed my brother's credibility, called him an overprotective father with anger issues. Jessica suffered another year before they finally transferred her. She's 30 now, still in therapy. The story had landed with weight. Marcus hadn't been the first father to face this, wouldn't be the last. The difference was that today he had 200 witnesses who wouldn't let the system spin its narrative unchallenged. That's why I came. That's why we all came. No more kids suffer alone. Raymond Cruz had rolled in at 5:15, his construction company logo visible on his truck that followed behind his Harley. Hammer, they called him for his years swinging sledgehammers on job sites before he'd saved enough to start his own contracting business. He was 62, built like the equipment he operated with hands that could crush stone, but that trembled slightly when he hugged his granddaughters. He'd walked to where Marcus stood with Doc and Ghost, and his presence had expanded their circle. No words had been necessary initially. The code was simple: brother calls, brothers answer. But after a moment, Hammer had spoken, his voice rough with emotion barely contained. Got two granddaughters, 8 and 10. If anyone hurt them like this, he'd stop shaking his head. You did right, Iron Shield. You protected your own. That's what men do. Michael Anderson had appeared at 5:28, his road king gleaming despite the October dust. Saying his road name earned not through religiosity, but through his tendency to give everyone the benefit of doubt exactly once before cutting them off permanently. He was 65, a Vietnam veteran who'd done 2 tours in the Central Highlands and had come home with shrapnel in his hip and nightmares that had taken decades to quiet. Saint had approached the growing cluster of leadership, Ghost, Marcus, Doc, Hammer, and his face had carried the particular expression of someone who understood exactly why this mattered. Served with your father, Iron Shield. 4th Marines, 68. He saved my life in Khe Sanh. Saint had paused, memory flickering across his features. He talked about you constantly, showed me pictures, said he was raising you to be the kind of man who'd stand up when standing up cost something. Marcus's throat had constricted. He'd been 15 when his father died, old enough to understand loss, but young enough that many memories had faded. Meeting men who'd served beside his father always felt like recovering fragments of something precious. He'd be proud of you today. This, Saint had gestured at the assembled bikes and riders. This is what he taught us. Protect those who can't protect themselves. Don't let systems grind down the innocent. Be the wall between danger and the defenseless. The words had resonated through Marcus like a tuning fork finding its frequency. His entire life had been shaped by lessons learned in a garage from a man who'd seen humanity at its worst and had chosen to be its best anyway. Today felt like honoring that legacy in the most fundamental way possible. By 5:30, the parking lot had transformed into something between a peaceful protest and a military operation. 200 motorcycles sat in precise rows, their chrome catching the late afternoon sun. 200 men stood beside their bigger machines, ages ranging from mid-30s to early 70s, representing every trade and profession: nurses and mechanics, teachers and electricians, veterans and small business owners, construction workers and computer technicians. The Hells Angels had always been more than the caricature media portrayed. These weren't outlaws or criminals. They were working men who'd found brotherhood in the shared experience of the road, who'd built families from choice rather than blood, who lived by codes older than the laws that tried to define them. Loyalty, honor, protection, words that sounded antiquated until you needed them, and then they became the only words that mattered. Officer Davis had been the first official responder, the school resource officer whose beat included Pinewood Elementary. He was 43, a 15-year veteran of the police force, and he'd seen enough situations to recognize when escalation would make things worse. He'd approached Ghost and Marcus with his hand resting on his radio, but not calling for backup yet. "Gentlemen, I'm Officer Davis. Can you tell me what's happening here?" Ghost had stepped forward, his posture relaxed, but his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Officer, we're here in support of a father whose daughter was abused by her teacher. Mr. Brennan witnessed the abuse firsthand. School administration attempted to dismiss his concerns. We're here to ensure that doesn't happen." Davis had surveyed the assembled riders, taking in the military service patches, the American flags, the discipline formation. "You planning any violence or property damage?" Marcus had answered, this time his voice steady. "No, sir. We're just standing here, waiting for accountability." "How long you planning to stay?" "Until someone from the school addresses what happened to children in their care." Davis had nodded slowly, making calculations based on years of experience. This wasn't a mob. This was organized, peaceful, purposeful. "All right, I'm going to need you to remain peaceful and let the school handle their business." "That's exactly what we're doing, officer." Standing here waiting, Davis had walked back toward the building, speaking quietly into his radio. Marcus had caught fragments: peaceful assembly, 200 motorcycles, requesting supervisor guidance but no immediate threat. Inside the school, visible through the large windows that faced the parking lot, teachers had begun gathering. Some had their phones out filming. Others had their hands pressed to the glass, trying to understand what they were witnessing. Principal Monroe had appeared in the main office window, her face pale, her phone pressed to her ear. The first parent to approach had been Angela Torres, 38, a single mother who worked 2 jobs to keep her son fed and housed. She'd been walking to her car after picking up Miguel from after-school care when she'd seen the motorcycles. Curiosity had drawn her closer, and when she'd overheard Ghost explaining the situation to Officer Davis, something had broken open inside her. She'd walked directly to Marcus, her eyes red from crying, her voice shaking but determined. "Are you Lily's father, the one who saw what Mrs. Hayes did?" Marcus had turned to face her, immediately recognizing the expression of someone carrying their own burden of helpless rage. "Yes, ma'am." Angela's breath had come out in a rush, part sob, part relief. "Thank you. Thank you for doing what I was too afraid to do. My son Miguel, he's 7. He's been in Mrs. Hayes' class since September. He has nightmares every night. He begs me not to send him to school. He started wetting the bed again last month." The details had matched Lily's symptoms with horrifying precision. Marcus had felt his chest tighten, understanding that his daughter hadn't been Hayes' only victim, perhaps not even her primary target. This was systematic, practiced, a pattern of abuse that had been operating in plain sight while administration looked away. "I complained to Principal Monroe 3 times. I have the emails. She told me Miguel was too sensitive, that I was raising him to expect things to be easy, that first grade required tougher standards than I was comfortable with." Angela's voice had cracked. "She made me feel like I was the problem, like I was a bad mother for being concerned. But I wasn't wrong, was I? I wasn't crazy. Marcus had placed a hand on her shoulder, the gesture gentle despite his own fury. You weren't wrong. None of us were wrong. They gaslight parents because it's easier than admitting they're protecting an abuser. Angela had pulled out her phone, fingers trembling, as she'd scrolled through emails. I documented everything. Every complaint, every dismissal, every time they told me I was overreacting. I have it all. Hold on to those. We're going to need documentation when this goes public. David Park had been next arriving, not to pick up a child, but because he'd heard what was happening through the parent phone tree that connected elementary school families. He was 67, a Vietnam veteran who'd spent 2 tours in the Mekong Delta and had come home with medals he'd never displayed and memories he'd never fully processed. He'd lost his wife to cancer 3 years ago, and now he was raising his grandson, trying to give the boy stability in a world that felt increasingly unstable. David had approached the growing cluster of parents and bikers with the steady gait of someone who'd walked through worse and survived. His grandson wasn't currently in Hayes' class. David had pulled him out mid-year the previous spring, transferred to a different school entirely. But hearing about what Marcus had witnessed had brought him back, had activated something in him that recognized fellow soldiers in the fight against institutional indifference. Mr. Brennan, I'm David Park. My grandson Marcus, named after my best friend, who died in Nam. He was in Mrs. Hayes' class last year. David's voice had carried the particular cadence of someone who'd learned to speak with precision because imprecision could get people killed. She destroyed him, 7 years old, and she had him convinced he was worthless. He developed panic attacks, full-blown anxiety disorder, had to put him in therapy. Ghost had stepped closer, recognizing something in David's bearing. You served 1st Cav 67 to 69. You Marines 72 to 76. The recognition between veterans had been instant, the understanding that transcended branch rivalry. They'd both seen what happened when systems failed, when leadership prioritized self-protection over mission, when the vulnerable were left undefended because defending them was inconvenient. David had continued, his jaw tight. I complained to Monroe, demanded my grandson be moved. She told me I was coddling him, that real world was tough, that I needed to let him develop resilience. I told her I'd survived Vietnam. I knew what tough meant, and what Hayes was doing wasn't tough. It was cruel. He'd paused, old anger surfacing. They labeled me difficult, troublesome, said I had anger issues from PTSD, tried to make my complaint about my mental health instead of Hayes' abuse. The pattern had been emerging with crystalline clarity. Isolated parents could be dismissed, gaslit, discredited. Their complaints could be buried under justifications and psychological diagnoses and suggestions that they were projecting their own issues onto innocent educators. But together with stories that corroborated each other with documentation and witnesses, the pattern became undeniable. More parents had arrived as word spread through text messages and phone calls. Sarah Mitchell, whose son had stopped eating lunch because Hayes called him Tubby in front of the class. Robert Williams, whose daughter had started cutting herself at age 7 because she believed she was too stupid to deserve to live. Jennifer Park, who had been told her concerns were cultural differences in discipline styles, a racist dismissal that had made her feel simultaneously angry and silenced. Each story had added weight to what was becoming impossible to ignore. 12 families, 15 children, symptoms ranging from anxiety and depression to self-harm and suicidal ideation, all dismissed. All gaslit, all told the problem was them, not the teacher with 20 years of experience and the highest test scores in the district. By 6 o'clock, the assembled crowd had grown beyond the bikers. More than 100 parents had arrived, drawn by the spectacle and staying once they'd understood its purpose. Some were current Pinewood families. Others had transferred their children out but had never understood why until now. The parking lot had become an impromptu support group, parents crying and hugging and sharing stories they'd carried alone for too long. The news vans had multiplied. 5 television stations now had cameras recording everything, reporters conducting interviews with bikers and parents, the story shifting from motorcycle gang intimidates school to fathers demand accountability for teacher abuse. The narrative was being written in real time, and for once the system couldn't control it. Amanda Rivers had emerged from the school building at 6:15, her face pale but determined. She was 32 in her 5th year of teaching, And she'd spent 3 of those years hearing things through the walls she'd shared with Victoria Hayes's classroom. She'd witnessed incidents in hallways. She'd seen children's faces after they'd left Hayes's room. And she'd stayed silent because speaking up would cost her job, her career, everything she'd worked for. Today, watching 200 bikers refuse to leave, watching parents finally being heard, something had broken in Amanda. Or perhaps something had finally been repaired. She'd walked to where Marcus stood with Ghost in the growing parent coalition, and her voice had trembled, but held. My name is Amanda Rivers. I teach fourth grade here. I need to tell you what I've seen. Marcus had recognized courage when he saw it. This woman was risking everything, her job, her livelihood, her professional reputation. But she was choosing truth over security, and that made her an ally worth protecting. We're listening. Amanda had taken a breath, steadying herself. I've heard Mrs. Hayes through the walls for 3 years. The things she says to students. I reported one incident directly to Vice Principal Chen. I witnessed her berating a second grader in the hallway, making him stand against the wall during recess, while other children played, telling him he was too stupid to deserve fun. I filed a written complaint. What happened? Vice Principal Chen told me that Mrs. Hayes had tenure, that she'd been teaching for 20 years, and that I needed to be very careful about making accusations against senior staff. Amanda's voice had hardened. The implication was clear: shut up, or it would affect my career. I was in my second year. I had student loans. I needed the job. Ghost had spoken, then his voice gentle despite his intimidating appearance. But you're speaking now. Why? Because I became a teacher to protect children, and instead I've been protecting a system that hurts them. I'm done. Amanda had met Marcus's eyes. I'll testify. I'll provide written statements. I'll lose my job if I have to, but I'm done being silent. The courage had rippled through the assembled crowd. If a teacher was willing to break ranks to confirm what parents had been saying, the administration's denials would crumble. This was the crack in the wall that would bring the whole structure down. Inside the school, visible through the windows, a different drama had been unfolding. Victoria Hayes sat in her classroom alone, listening to the rumble of motorcycles outside, watching the crowd grow. Her hands shook as she graded papers. She couldn't focus on trying to maintain the routine that had kept her sane for 2 decades. She'd been 8 years old when her father came home from Korea. Changed. The war had taken something from him, compassion maybe, or patience, or the ability to see children as anything other than soldiers who needed hardening. He'd yelled at her for every mistake, every moment of weakness, every sign that she might not survive in a world that ate the soft. She'd learned that love meant pushing hard, that caring meant refusing to coddle, that preparing children for reality meant showing them no mercy now so they'd be ready for the merciless world waiting outside. But somewhere along the way, she'd become her father. The realization sat in her chest like a stone, growing heavier with each passing moment. She'd told herself she was helping them, toughening them up, giving them skills they'd need. But looking at the crowd outside, at the parents, crying at the 200 men who'd come, because one father had finally said enough, she couldn't maintain the lie anymore. She'd become the monster. Principal Monroe had appeared in Hayes's doorway, her professional composure cracking under the pressure of cameras and crowds, and the undeniable reality that this couldn't be managed away. Victoria, we need to talk. Now. Hayes had followed Monroe to the principal's office, her legs feeling disconnected from her body. Monroe had shut the door and pulled a file from her desk drawer, a file Hayes had never seen before, labeled with her name and marked Confidential Personnel. 17 complaints, Victoria, over 3 years. 17 families saying similar things. I protected you. I made them go away. I told parents they were overreacting, told them you had high standards, told them their children needed to develop resilience. Monroe's voice had risen with each sentence, stress fracturing her usual control. I protected you because your test scores are the highest in the district, because you make us look good, because admitting we had a problem meant investigations and liability and budget cuts we can't afford. Hayes had stared at the file, at the documentation of complaints she'd never known existed. You never told me parents were complaining. Because I handled it. That's what administrators do. We handle problems. But this, Monroe had gestured toward the window, toward the sea of motorcycles and cameras and parents. This I can't handle. 200 bikers with cameras rolling. This is national news by morning. The betrayal had been mutual. Monroe had protected Hayes to protect herself, to protect the school's reputation, to protect test scores and funding. Hayes had been enabled by a system that valued results over humanity. They'd both failed, and now children had paid the price. What happens now? Monroe's expression had hardened the shift from co-conspirator to self-preservation visible in real time. Now you're the problem I have to handle. The district will investigate. The state will investigate. You'll be suspended, probably terminated. Your teaching license will be reviewed. And you, boy, Beteka. I'm retiring. Early retirement, full pension. They'll let me go quietly because forcing me out publicly means admitting systemic failure. Monroe had met Hayes's eyes with something between pity and contempt. You were convenient, Victoria. Your scores were good. Your methods were questionable, but as long as nobody made too much noise, we could pretend everything was fine. But now someone made noise that can't be silenced. Hayes had sat in the chair across from Monroe's desk, understanding that she'd been used as thoroughly as she'd used the children. The system had protected her until protecting her became inconvenient, and now she'd be sacrificed to preserve the system itself. Dr. Raymond Foster had arrived at 6:30. The superintendent called in to manage a crisis that threatened to consume the entire district. He was 62, a Vietnam veteran who'd served in the Army before becoming an educator, and he carried himself with the bearing of someone who'd seen systems fail before and understood the cost of such failures. Foster had stepped out of his district vehicle and surveyed the parking lot with the practiced assessment of a commanding officer evaluating a battlefield. 200 motorcycles, 100 plus parents, 5 news vans, police maintaining perimeter but not intervening. A situation that couldn't be dispersed, couldn't be dismissed, couldn't be managed with the usual tools of bureaucratic deflection. He'd walked directly to where Ghost and Marcus stood at the center of the assembly, and his eyes had immediately caught the service patches on several jackets. Vietnam, Korea, Desert Storm. These weren't troublemakers. These were veterans, and Foster recognized his own. Ghost had straightened slightly old military posture, asserting itself. Sir. Foster had nodded acknowledgement. Gentlemen, I'm Dr. Raymond Foster, District Superintendent. I need to understand what happened here. Marcus had stepped forward, meeting the superintendent's eyes directly. Sir, I witnessed my daughter being verbally abused by her teacher. I reported through proper channels. I was ignored and threatened with CPS investigation. These men are here, so my concerns can't be dismissed. Foster had looked at Ghost. You organized this response. We organized to protect a child. Same reason some of us wore the uniform, sir. The words had landed. Foster's expression had shifted from administrative concern to something more personal. He'd seen his veteran's ball cap, the one he wore on weekends, sitting in his car. He'd put it on before approaching again, the cap that identified him as Army Vietnam, 1968 to 1969. When he'd returned, Ghost had recognized it immediately. 1st Cav, 4th Infantry, U Marines, 72 to 76. David Park had stepped closer. 1st Cav here too, 67 to 69. The recognition between veterans had created a shift in the dynamic. This wasn't citizens versus authority anymore. This was soldiers recognizing each other across the lines that usually divided them, understanding that sometimes the mission required standing together regardless of which side of the badge you were on. Foster had addressed the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd led men in combat. I'm going to ask for 1 hour. Let me review what I can, talk to my staff, understand the full scope. I'm not asking you to leave. I'm asking you to give me time to do this right. Marcus had exchanged looks with Ghost, then with David Park, then with the other parents who'd become impromptu leadership. The question was whether they could trust Foster to actually address this rather than simply buying time to craft a better cover-up. Ghost had answered for the group. Veteran to veteran, sir, I'm going to hold you to that. 1 hour, but we're not leaving until we see action. Understood and respected. Foster had walked back into the school building, and for 53 minutes the assembled crowd had waited. Parents had continued sharing stories. Documentation had been photographed. Reporters had continued filming. The sun had begun its final descent, and the October evening had turned cool, but nobody had left. At 7:23, Foster had emerged from the building accompanied by three school board members, Principal Monroe looking significantly diminished, and Vice Principal Chen looking like he wished he were anywhere else. They'd walked to a position near the front entrance where the media cameras could capture everything, and Foster had pulled out a prepared statement, then visibly crumpled it and set it aside. "I'm not going to read bureaucratic language. I'm going to tell you what I found and what I'm doing about it." His voice had carried across the parking lot, amplified by the silence of 200 people holding their breath. "I've spent the last hour reviewing files, reading complaint emails, interviewing staff. What I found is systematic failure at multiple levels. Mrs. Victoria Hayes engaged in emotional abuse of students. Multiple complaints were filed by parents and buried by administration. Test scores were prioritized over child welfare. That ends tonight." The crowd had remained silent, waiting for specifics for actions rather than promises. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Hayes is suspended without pay, pending full investigation by external firm. Principal Monroe is retiring effective immediately. I'm requesting State Education Board review of our district policies. Every family affected will be contacted personally by me, and I'm implementing emergency policy changes starting tomorrow morning." Foster had paused, and the weight of 200 witnesses had seemed to settle on him. "To the men who came here today on motorcycles, I see your service patches. Vietnam, Korea. You answered a call today the same way you answered your nation's call. Not with violence, not with threats, but with presence, with witness, with refusal to let wrong go unanswered. Thank you for your service, then and now." The words had resonated through the assembled veterans' recognition from someone who understood what service meant, what standing up cost. But Marcus had stepped forward, his voice carrying across the parking lot. "Sir, with respect, promises have been made to parents before. They were broken. How do we know this time is different?" Foster had met his eyes, and the superintendent's expression had reflected something rare in bureaucrats: genuine humility. "You don't. You can't. Words are cheap. So here's what I offer: my word as a veteran, my word as a father, and my commitment to meet with a parent coalition monthly until you believe change is real. If I fail, you come back with 400 bikes if you need to, and I'll deserve it." When the answer had been honest in a way administrative responses rarely were. No guarantees, no promises that everything would be perfect. Just a commitment to treat and an acknowledgement that continued vigilance would be necessary. Marcus had nodded slowly. "We'll be watching, sir. I expect nothing less, Mr. Brennan." The crowd had begun to disperse slowly, bikers mounting their machines, parents exchanging contact information, reporters conducting final interviews. The crisis had passed into the next phase, not resolution, but accountability beginning. Marcus had been preparing to leave to drive to Rosa's house and collect Lily to start the process of healing when a woman in a blazer carrying a briefcase had approached. Her expression had been professional, but not unkind, and when she'd spoken, Marcus's world had tilted again. "Mr. Brennan, I'm Margaret Stevens, Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you regarding Lily." The words had hit like a physical blow. Ghost had immediately stepped closer, his presence protective. Marcus had forced his voice to remain steady. "What about her?" Stevens had pulled papers from her briefcase, her tone suggesting she was following protocol rather than attacking. "We received a report this morning from school administration citing concerns about your ability to provide a stable environment. The report mentions aggressive behavior towards school staff association with potentially dangerous organization, disruption of school environment, questions about household stability. I'm required to investigate. I'll need to conduct a home visit and interview Lily tomorrow at 2 p.m. Marcus had felt the trap spring fully closed. The school board member who'd filed the report had done it before the biker demonstration, preemptive warfare, to discredit the whistleblower before he could speak. Even with 200 witnesses, even with Foster's promises, the system still had weapons it could deploy. "They're retaliating. This is retaliation for speaking up." Stevens had looked at him with an expression that suggested she'd seen this pattern before. "Mr. Brennan, I have to investigate all reports. It's my job, but I'll conduct a fair investigation." Ghost had stepped between them, his voice respectful but firm. "Ma'am, may I speak?" Stevens had looked at him, taking in the leather vest, the patches, the military bearing. And you are, Jake Rivera, president of this motorcycle club, retired Marine, and I need you to understand what you're looking at here. Ghost's voice had carried conviction earned through years of living by codes that predated child welfare agencies. Marcus Brennan is the most devoted father I know. Single parent since his daughter was 2, works construction 10 hours a day, comes home and braids her hair. Never missed a school event. That report was filed by a school system trying to cover its own failure. Ma'am, I've known Marcus 15 years. I trust him with my life. More importantly, I trust him with my daughter's life. Stevens had listened, her expression unreadable, then had turned back to Marcus. Mr. Rivera's testimony is noted, but I still have a job to do. Mr. Brennan, I'll see you tomorrow at 2 p.m. Have Lily available. Keep your house presentable. Answer questions honestly. She'd paused at her car door, and her voice had softened slightly. Off the record, I've seen retaliatory reports before, but I still have to investigate. Be prepared. After Stevens had driven away, Marcus had stood in the parking lot as the crowd dispersed, feeling the weight of what came next. He could lose Lily not for failing as a father, but for succeeding, for refusing to let his daughter suffer, for challenging authority, for demanding accountability. Ghost had remained beside him as other bikers prepared to leave. Brother, you need anything for tomorrow? I don't know what I need. How do you prove you are a good father to someone who's already decided you might not be? You show them the truth. Clean apartment, stocked fridge, evidence of involved parenting. And you remember you are not alone in this. Doc had approached his medical expertise, making him practical. Marcus, document everything. Take photos of Lily's room, the kitchen, anywhere they might inspect. Have Rosa available as a character witness. Keep records of everything you do for Lily's school involvement, medical appointments, activities. Make it impossible for them to deny you're a present father. David Park had joined them, his hand resting on Marcus's shoulder. I went through something similar when I got custody of my grandson after my daughter's addiction issues. CPS investigated me, 70-year-old man raising a 6-year-old. They had concerns, but I showed them the truth, and truth wins. Eventually. The veterans had formed a protective circle around Marcus, their presence a reminder that he wasn't facing this alone. Bulldog had been the last to approach before leaving, his normally gruff voice softened by concern. Rosa and I will be at your apartment tomorrow, 2 p.m. We're family, Marcus. They need to see that Lily has community support, stability. We'll make sure they see it. By 8 o'clock, the parking lot had emptied except for Marcus and Ghost. The school building sat dark and silent, its windows reflecting the streetlights that had flickered on as dusk deepened into night. The day had stretched impossibly long, from witnessing abuse at 11:30 to this moment, standing in the aftermath of something that felt both like victory and like the opening salvo of a longer war. Ghost had leaned against his bike, not mounting it, yet staying with Marcus until the last possible moment. You did good today, brother. Your father would be proud. Marcus had thought about his father's photograph, about the young Marine who'd survived Vietnam and come home to teach his son about duty and honor and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. I hope so. I keep wondering if I should have done this sooner. If I'd acted after the first week instead of trusting the system. Don't do that. Don't second guess. You acted when you had evidence. You followed proper channels first. You did everything right, and when the system failed, you did what was necessary. That's not something to regret. CPS tomorrow. I could lose her, Ghost. After everything, I could still lose her. Ghost had straightened, his expression hardening into the resolve that had carried him through combat and through decades of civilian life, where different battles required fighting. Then we fight that battle too. Tomorrow at 2, I'll be there. Doc will be there. Bulldog and Rosa will be there. You won't face that caseworker alone. You won't face any of this alone. The words had provided no guarantees, no promises that everything would be fine. But they'd offered something more fundamental: brotherhood. The knowledge that standing up for right didn't mean standing alone. Marcus had finally climbed into his truck, exhaustion settling into his bones as adrenaline faded. His phone had buzzed, a text from Rosa. Lily's asking for you. We made cookies. She's safe. Come home. The drive to Rosa's house had taken 18 minutes, and with each minute, Marcus had felt the day's events settling into something he'd need to process later. For now, he needed to see his daughter, to hold her, to reassure her that everything would be okay even if he wasn't entirely certain himself. Rosa had opened the door before Marcus could knock, her expression warm with understanding. Behind her, Lily had appeared, chocolate smudges on her face, her eyes brightening when she'd seen her father. "Daddy!" Marcus had knelt, catching her as she'd run to him, lifting her into his arms despite his exhaustion. She'd wrapped her arms around his neck, and he'd held her close, breathing in the scent of cookies and strawberry shampoo and safety. "Did you fix it?" Lily had whispered against his shoulder. Marcus had carried her to Rosa's couch, sitting with Lily in his lap, her head tucked under his chin. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm fixing it. Mrs. Hayes won't be teaching anymore. You won't ever have to see her again. Promise. Promise, and tomorrow we're going to talk to a nice lady who just wants to make sure you're happy and safe. Her name is Mrs. Stevens, and she's going to ask you some questions. I need you to tell her the truth about everything, okay? About school, about home, about how you feel." Lily had pulled back to look at his face. "Am I in trouble?" "No, baby, you're never in trouble. Miss Stevens just needs to make sure daddies are taking good care of their kids. And I am taking good care of you, right?" Lily had nodded, her small hand patting his cheek. "You're the best daddy. You came when I needed you." The words had broken something in Marcus's chest, tears he'd been holding back all in the day finally slipping free. He'd pulled Lily close again, and Rosa had quietly excused herself to give them privacy. Marcus had carried Lily to the truck 20 minutes later, strapping her into the booster seat with practiced ease. The drive home had been quiet, Lily falling asleep before they'd left Rosa's neighborhood, exhaustion claiming her small body. Marcus had driven carefully, checking the rearview mirror every few seconds to watch his daughter sleep peacefully for the first time in months. At home, he carried her to bed without waking her, tucking her in with her favorite stuffed rabbit, smoothing her hair back from her face. Standing in her doorway, watching her chest rise and fall with even breathing, Marcus had felt the weight of what tomorrow might bring. The CPS investigation could take everything. Could decide that a single father who worked construction and rode with a motorcycle club wasn't suitable regardless of how much he loved his daughter. Could determine that challenging school authority demonstrated instability rather than appropriate advocacy. But standing there watching his daughter sleep without nightmares for the first time in 3 months, Marcus had known he'd made the right choice. Whatever came next, Lily would know her father had fought for her, would know that adults could be trusted to protect her, would know that speaking up mattered even when speaking up cost you everything. His phone had buzzed with a text from Ghost. "Tomorrow 1:30 p.m. I'll be there. Doc Bulldog Rosa confirmed too. We got you, brother." Marcus had looked at his father's photograph on the wall, at the young Marine frozen in time at 23. Forever young, forever certain. He'd whispered to the photograph, to the memory, to the lesson. "I hope I did right, Dad. I hope this was the way." The photograph had offered no answer, but Marcus had felt something settle in his chest anyway. His father had taught him to stand up when standing up cost something. Today, surrounded by brothers who'd answered his call, he'd stood. Tomorrow, he'd stand again. And he'd keep standing until his daughter was safe and the system was forced to change. Because that's what fathers did. That's what brotherhood meant. And that's what honor required. The morning sun had barely cleared the horizon when Marcus woke, his body refusing sleep despite the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. The digital clock read 5:47, and he lay staring at the ceiling for 3 minutes before giving up on rest entirely. Today at 2 o'clock, a stranger would arrive with the power to take his daughter away, and no amount of brotherhood solidarity could change that fundamental vulnerability. He moved through the apartment with purposeful efficiency, cleaning what was already clean, organizing what was already organized. The act was ritual rather than necessity, but it gave his hands something to do besides shake. He photographed everything Doc had suggested: Lily's room, with its neatly made bed and shelves of books, the kitchen with its stocked refrigerator and meal planning calendar on the wall, the homework area with completed assignments organized in folders. Evidence of involved parenting documented and ready for scrutiny. Lily appeared in the kitchen doorway at 7:15, rubbing sleep from her eyes. For the first time in months, she'd slept through the night without waking, without nightmares, without tears. The absence of trauma felt like its own small miracle. She climbed onto the stool at the counter, watching Marcus crack eggs into a bowl. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, the kind of quiet that came from years of breakfast routines and unspoken understanding. Marcus set a plate of scrambled eggs and toast in front of her, and Lily ate with an appetite he hadn't seen since August. The knot in his chest loosened fractionally. Whatever happened today with CPS, his daughter was healing already. That had to count for something. Lily looked up from her breakfast, her voice small but steady. "Daddy, the lady who's coming today. Ms. Stevens, what if she doesn't like me?" Marcus sat beside her, eye level, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Sweetheart, she's not there to like or not like you. She's there to make sure you're safe and loved. And you are safe. You are loved. More than anything in this world. But what if she thinks I should live somewhere else?" The question struck at the core fear Marcus had been trying not to name. He chose honesty over false reassurance, trusting that Lily deserved truth even when truth was frightening. "Then I'll fight to keep you with me. I'll show her every reason why we belong together. But Lily, I need you to do something for me. When Ms. Stevens asks questions, tell her the truth. About school, about home, about how you feel. Don't try to say what you think she wants to hear. Just be honest. Can you do that?" Lily nodded, her small hand finding his. "I'll tell her you're the best daddy, that you make me breakfast and help with homework and read me stories. I'll tell her you saved me." The words lodged in Marcus's throat, making speech impossible for several seconds. He pulled her into a hug, holding her carefully, aware that this might be one of the last times if Stevens decided against him. Ghost arrived at 1:15, 45 minutes early, his presence both support and statement. He wore clean jeans and a button-down shirt rather than his riding vest, and his hair was pulled back neatly. The transformation was subtle but deliberate, not hiding who he was, but presenting the version of himself that might reassure a caseworker that stability existed here. Doc pulled up 10 minutes later in his civilian vehicle, also dressed in street clothes that suggested responsible adult rather than intimidating biker. Bulldog and Rosa arrived together, Rosa carrying a casserole she'd made that morning, the kind of dish neighbors brought to show care and community. By 1:45, Marcus's apartment looked like what it actually was, a home filled with people who cared about the child who lived here, adults who showed up when showing up mattered. The transformation was honest rather than performative, evidence rather than theater. Margaret Stevens arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, her punctuality suggesting someone who took the job seriously. She stepped into the apartment and paused, taking in the assembled group with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. Marcus made introductions, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Miss Stevens, this is Jake Rivera, my club president and friend for 15 years. Daniel Patterson, a nurse. Thomas Chen and his wife Rosa, who've known Lily since she was born." Stevens nodded to each person, her assessment clinical but not cold. "Quite a support system, Mr. Brennan, though I'll need to speak with you and Lily privately first." Ghost led the others to wait outside, but not before Rosa pressed the casserole into Stevens' hands with a warm smile. "For after. Chicken and rice enough for 3 days. We take care of each other around here." And the gesture was perfect, not obvious bribery, just the kind of thing people who cared about each other did naturally. Stevens accepted it with thanks, and her expression softened almost imperceptibly. The home inspection took 40 minutes. Stevens moved through each room with methodical thoroughness, opening cabinets, checking smoke detectors, noting the child safety locks on cleaning supplies, and the photographs covering every available surface. Marcus followed at a respectful distance, answering questions, when asked, providing context without over-explaining. In Lily's room, Stevens lingered on the bookshelves, her fingers trailing across spines. "You read to her?" "Every night she picks 3 books, usually the same 3 for a week, then she rotates." "And these drawings?" Stevens gestured at the artwork covering one wall, bright colors and stick figures and rainbows. "New ones, from the past 2 days. She stopped drawing for months when—" Marcus caught himself modulating his voice away from anger. "When school was difficult, she's starting again." Stevens made notes, her face revealing nothing. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator, documenting the fresh produce, the balanced meal options, the juice boxes, and string cheese that spoke to awareness of a child's preferences. She found the calendar on the wall, the one tracking Lily's school schedule, upcoming appointments, planned activities. "You maintain this?" "Yes, ma'am. Helps me balance work with being present for what matters." Stevens photographed the calendar, then turned to face Marcus directly. Mr. Brennan, the report filed against you suggests instability, aggressive behavior, involvement with a dangerous organization. But what I'm seeing here is organization care and substantial community support. Those things don't typically coexist with the profile described in the complaint. Marcus measured his response carefully, aware that this might be the moment that determined everything. Ma'am, I work construction. I'm a member of a motorcycle club. To some people, those things suggest I'm not suitable to raise a daughter. But I've spent 6 years proving that stable parenting looks different than the stereotype suggests. And when my daughter was being abused, I did what any parent should do. I protected her. The school didn't like being challenged. That's why they filed the report. Stevens nodded slowly, neither confirming nor denying, simply absorbing information. I'd like to speak with Lily now, alone. The next 20 minutes felt like hours. Marcus waited in the kitchen while Stevens interviewed Lily in the living room, their voices too quiet to distinguish words, but the tone remaining calm, conversational. Through the doorway, he could see Lily's face, serious but not frightened, answering questions with the careful honesty they'd practiced. When Stevens finally called him back, Lily was sitting on the couch with her stuffed rabbit clutched in her lap, looking small but composed. Stevens's expression had shifted, the professional neutrality giving way to something warmer, more human. She addressed Lily first. Thank you for talking with me, Lily. You were very brave and very honest. Then to Marcus, Mr. Brennan, can we speak outside? The walk to Stevens' car felt like walking to judgment. Ghost stood on the sidewalk with the others, his presence steady and reassuring. Stevens pulled her briefcase from the passenger seat and withdrew papers, but she didn't hand them to Marcus immediately. Mr. Brennan, I've conducted these investigations for 23 years. I've seen neglect. I've seen abuse. I've seen households where children aren't safe. She paused, meeting his eyes directly. This is not one of those households. The relief nearly buckled Marcus's knees, but Stevens continued before he could speak. Your daughter is well cared for, loved and safe. She speaks about you with genuine affection. She describes specific instances of your involvement in her life, braiding her hair, making her lunch with notes, reading to her every night. She told me about school, about Mrs. Hayes, about how you saved her by refusing to let the abuse continue. Stevens closed her briefcase with finality. This report was retaliatory. I'm noting in my findings that the complaint appears motivated by the school's desire to discredit a parent who legitimately advocated for his child. My recommendation is case closure as unfounded. You're a good father, Mr. Brennan. Keep being one. The words landed with weight that went beyond simple relief. Validation from someone whose job was to identify bad parenting meant more than Marcus could articulate. He managed to keep his voice steady. Thank you. Thank you for conducting a fair investigation. Don't thank me. I'm just doing my job. You did yours. You protected your daughter. That's what parents are supposed to do. Stevens paused at her car door. One more thing. If the school board tries to use this investigation against you in any way, call me. I'll testify to what I found. After Stevens drove away, Ghost approached with a grin that transformed his typically intimidating face. Told you, brother. Truth wins. The celebration was subdued but genuine. Rosa hugged Marcus hard enough to compress ribs. Doc shook his hand with the firm grip of someone who understood how close disaster had come. Bulldog simply nodded, the gesture containing volumes of unspoken support. Inside the apartment, Lily sat exactly where they'd left her, still clutching the stuffed rabbit. Marcus knelt in front of her, taking her small hands in his large ones. Ms. Stevens said you're staying with me. We're okay, sweetheart. Everything's going to be okay. Lily launched herself into his arms, and Marcus held her while she cried. Not frightened tears this time, but relief, the letting go of fear she'd been carrying. He rocked her, gently murmuring reassurances, feeling the last of the previous day's tension drain from his own body. That evening, after Rosa's casserole had been eaten and the visitors had left, Marcus received a phone call from Dr. Foster. The superintendent's voice carried weariness earned through confronting institutional failure. Mr. Brennan, I wanted to update you personally. The investigation firm began work today. Full interviews with current and former students, parents, staff. They're thorough, independent, and they have full access to all records. This will take approximately 6 weeks. And in the meantime, Mrs. Hayes remains suspended without pay. We've assigned a substitute teacher to her class, and I've personally met with those families to apologize and offer support resources. Principal Monroe's retirement is final as of Friday. We're conducting a national search for her replacement. Marcus absorbed the information, recognizing these as genuine actions rather than performative promises. Thank you for following through. Mr. Brennan, I spent 35 years in education believing the system worked. Yesterday taught me that systems only work when people refuse to let them fail. You refused. That matters. The investigation that unfolded over the next 6 weeks revealed damage more extensive than even Marcus had imagined. The independent firm interviewed 38 students who'd passed through Victoria Hayes's classroom over the previous 3 years. The findings, compiled into a 67-page report that Marcus would eventually read in its entirety, painted a picture of systematic emotional abuse enabled by institutional complicity. 29 of 38 students reported fear of their teacher. 18 described specific humiliation incidents, with details consistent enough to establish pattern rather than perception. 12 exhibited measurable trauma symptoms, anxiety disorders, depression, regression in developmental milestones, psychosomatic illness. The interviews had been conducted by child psychologists trained in trauma-informed questioning, and the children's testimony was damning in its consistency. Hayes was described as having two faces: performative warmth when administrators or visitors were present, cruelty when alone with students. Several children used nearly identical language. She's nice when the principal watches, mean when she leaves. The parent interviews corroborated the pattern. 17 families had filed formal written complaints. 9 more had complained verbally but had been discouraged from documenting concerns. All reported being told variations of the same script. Overreacting, too sensitive children need to develop resilience. First grade requires adjustment. The documentation of dismissed complaints proved particularly damning. Principal Monroe's email responses followed a template so consistent it suggested district-level training in liability avoidance, acknowledge concern, provide educational justification, subtly redirect blame toward home environment or child's emotional regulation, offer resources that position problem as originating outside classroom. Staff interviews conducted with anonymity protections revealed that 12 of 14 teachers had heard concerning interactions through shared walls. 6 had witnessed incidents directly. 4 had reported to administration and been told explicitly or implicitly to remain silent. The culture of silence had been maintained through a combination of fear, challenging senior staff could affect one's own career, and rationalization that Hayes's high test scores indicated effective teaching despite unorthodox methods. The financial audit uncovered what Foster had suspected: the district had quietly settled 3 lawsuits in the previous 5 years related to teacher misconduct. Non-disclosure agreements had kept the settlements confidential, and the cost of silence had been deemed cheaper than the cost of admitting systematic problems. School board member Richard Thornton, an attorney, had advised this approach in documented emails that would eventually surface during discovery. The final report, delivered to the school board 6 weeks after the parking lot demonstration, concluded with language that left no room for interpretation. Victoria Hayes engaged in systematic emotional abuse of students over a minimum 3-year period. School administration, specifically, Principal Patricia Monroe, failed in the duty to protect students by dismissing legitimate complaints, prioritizing test scores over child welfare, and creating a culture of silence among staff. This represents institutional failure at multiple levels, requiring comprehensive reform. The school board meeting where findings were presented was scheduled for November 22nd, exactly 38 days after Marcus had stood in Hayes's doorway. The auditorium at district headquarters was packed beyond capacity, standing room only with overflow, watching via live stream in adjacent rooms. 400 people had shown up: parents, teachers, community members, reporters, and 20 bikers who'd taken the evening off work to bear witness. Marcus sat in the front row with Lily beside him, Angela Torres on his other side, David Park behind them. The parent coalition they'd formed, officially named Voices for Safe Schools, had grown to encompass 23 families directly affected by Hayes, plus another 47 who joined in solidarity after hearing the stories. Superintendent Foster presented the findings himself, reading excerpts that made parents weep and teachers shift uncomfortably in their seats. He didn't minimize, didn't spin, didn't protect the institution at the expense of truth. When he finished, the silence in the auditorium was absolute. Foster set down the report and addressed the crowd without notes. We failed you. We failed your children. And I want to be absolutely clear about what that means. We didn't fail through ignorance. We failed through choice. We chose test scores over trauma. We chose reputation over responsibility. We chose to silence complaints rather than address them. That was wrong, and it stops today. The immediate actions were substantial and specific. Hayes' termination was finalized. Her teaching license referred to the state board with a recommendation for permanent revocation. Monroe's forced retirement was made explicit, her full benefits package denied due to documented failure of duty. Thornton faced censure and removal from education committee positions pending ethics investigation. District-wide reforms were announced with implementation timelines and accountability measures. Cameras would be installed in all classrooms within 60 days, with footage accessible to parents through secure online portal. An anonymous 24/7 reporting hotline would be operational within 2 weeks, managed by external agency to prevent internal suppression. Quarterly psychological screenings for all students would begin next semester. Zero-tolerance policy for emotional or verbal abuse would be codified in teacher contracts, with violations resulting in immediate suspension pending investigation. A parent liaison position would be created within each school, providing an advocate for families navigating concerns about their children's education. Teacher training on trauma-informed practices would become mandatory annual professional development, with outside experts conducting sessions. School board member Patricia Mendez stepped to the microphone after Foster finished, her voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the political cost of honesty. I've served on this board for 8 years. I've approved policies that prioritize metrics over humanity. I've voted to settle lawsuits quietly rather than address root causes. I've been part of the problem. She paused and her voice strengthened. But I'm also part of the solution going forward. These reforms will be implemented. They will be funded. They will be monitored. And if this board fails to follow through, vote us out. You have that power. Use it. When the floor opened for public comment, Angela Torres was first to speak. She walked to the microphone with papers clutched in her hands. The documentation she'd kept of Miguel's suffering, the emails she'd sent that went unanswered, the medical records showing anxiety disorder diagnosed in a 7-year-old. Her voice shook but held. My son had nightmares for 6 months. I complained 3 times. I was told I was too sensitive, that I was raising my son to be weak. Today, I'm vindicated, but my son still wakes up crying. This investigation found what happened, but it can't undo the damage. We need to make sure it never happens again. David Park spoke next, his Vietnam veteran's bearing commanding instant respect. I'm 70 years old. I've seen injustice in many forms, but I've also seen good people stand up when it matters. Marcus Brennan stood up. His brother stood up. That's what honor looks like. That's what we fought for, so children could be safe. Don't let this moment fade. Keep the pressure. Stay vigilant. Marcus was called to speak last, and he walked to the microphone with Lily's hand in his. She'd asked to come with him, to be seen as more than a victim, to participate in her own story. He lifted her so she stood on the chair beside the microphone, her small presence beside him speaking louder than words. 6 weeks ago, I was a single dad who thought he was crazy. I thought maybe I didn't understand how school worked. Maybe I was being overprotective. Maybe I wasn't good enough as a parent to know what was normal. Marcus's voice remained steady, his hand on Lily's shoulder. But I listened to my gut. I listened to my daughter. And I refused to accept that her pain was normal. I'm not a hero. I'm just a father who saw his daughter hurting and refused to look away. He paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. But I learned something through this. One voice can be dismissed. Voices together cannot be ignored. I had 200 brothers stand with me. Now I have dozens of parents standing together. We're not going away. We will monitor these policy changes. We will attend school board meetings. We will be the permanent reminder that children deserve protection. And if this system fails again, he let the pause carry weight. We'll be back. The standing ovation started with the bikers, then spread through parents, then community members. Even some school board members stood, recognizing that this moment required humility rather than defensiveness. After the meeting, as crowds dispersed and reporters conducted final interviews, A woman approached Marcus in the parking lot. She was thin, worn her professional clothes hanging slightly loose as if recently purchased for an occasion that required them. When she spoke, her voice carried the particular quality of someone forcing themselves to do something terrifying. Mr. Brennan, I'm Victoria Hayes. I wondered if you and Lily would be willing to meet with me, to let me apologize properly. The request landed like a punch. Marcus's first instinct was refusal protection of his daughter from further contact with the person who'd hurt her. But something in Hayes's expression, genuine remorse rather than performative redemption, made him pause. Why bow? Because I need to say what I should have said months ago, because Lily deserves to hear that she was never the problem, because Hayes's voice cracked, because I need to face what I did, not for my benefit, for hers. Marcus looked down at Lily, who'd been listening silently. Sweetheart, Mrs. Hayes wants to say she's sorry. Do you want to hear it? Lily had considered with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned to weigh decisions. Will you be there? Right beside you the whole time? Then okay. The meeting was arranged for the following week at Dr. Tran's office, neutral ground, with Lily's therapist present. Marcus arrived early with Lily, her small hand gripping his with familiar intensity. Hayes was already there, looking diminished in ways that went beyond physical presence. When they entered the office, Hayes stood, then seemed uncertain whether standing showed respect or aggression. She settled for remaining very still, her hands clasped in front of her. Dr. Tran facilitated the opening, establishing ground rules, and reminding everyone that this was for Lily's benefit, not Hayes's absolution. Then she nodded to Hayes, giving permission to speak. Hayes knelt, bringing herself to Lily's eye level, and the tears were already falling. Lily, I need to tell you something very important. Everything I said to you was wrong. You are not stupid. You never were. You are not lazy. You never were. You are a smart, kind, wonderful little girl, and I hurt you badly. Her voice broke, but she continued. I said terrible things to you. I made you feel small and worthless. And there is no excuse for that. I told myself I was helping you, that I was preparing you for a tough world. But the truth is I was broken, and I broke you, and I'm so sorry. Lily's voice was quiet but steady. Why were you mean to me? Hayes took a shaking breath. Because when I was a little girl, someone was mean to me. My father came home from war changed, and he thought being harsh made people strong. I grew up believing that, but I was wrong. Being mean doesn't help, it just hurts. And I hurt you, and I'm sorry. Lily looked at Marcus, seeking permission or reassurance or confirmation that this adult's words could be trusted. Marcus gave the slightest nod, and Lily turned back to Hayes with the question that mattered most. Did you mean it when you said I was stupid? Hayes met her eyes with something that looked like it cost everything. No, I never should have said it. It was never true. You are smart. You are good. And I was completely, absolutely wrong. Lily processed this, her small face serious. Then she looked at Marcus again. Daddy, can we go now? Of course, sweetheart. As they stood to leave, Lily turned back one more time. Mrs. Hayes? Hayes looked up, hope and pain warring in her expression. Yes, I forgive you, but I'm glad I don't have to see you anymore. The words were simple, honest, the grace of a child who'd been given permission to set boundaries alongside offering mercy. Hayes broke down fully after they left, and Dr. Tran would later tell Marcus that the breakdown had been therapeutic, necessary, the first step in Hayes confronting what she'd become. For Marcus and Lily, the meeting provided closure without requiring relationship. They'd given Hayes the opportunity to apologize. Lily had received acknowledgement that the abuse wasn't her fault, and they'd both been able to walk away knowing they'd handled it with dignity. The healing that mattered most was happening at Riverside Elementary, where Lily had started 3 weeks earlier. Marcus had toured 5 schools after withdrawing her from Pinewood, and Riverside had distinguished itself through warmth that felt genuine rather than performed. Principal Dr. James Washington had greeted them personally, his handshake firm, his interest in Lily's well-being evident in questions that suggested he'd done his homework about her situation. The classroom observation had sealed the decision, Miss Sarah Kim teaching first grade, with patience that never felt forced and standards that never felt weaponized. The difference was visible in details. When a student spilled paint, Miss Kim smiled and said, accidents happen, then help clean without making the child feel ashamed. When another student struggled with a math problem, she knelt beside the desk and worked through it together, never once suggesting the child was inadequate for needing help. Lily had watched with wide eyes, seeing for the first time what school could be when adults prioritize learning over control. Her first day at Riverside had been marked by normal new student anxiety, rather than the existential dread that had characterized Pinewood mornings. She'd clung to Marcus's hand walking to the classroom, but when Miss Kim had knelt to greet her warmly and introduced her to Maya, "She loves drawing too," Lily had managed a small smile. After school that first day, Lily had actually talked in full sentences about her day, about Maya sharing colored pencils, about the story Miss Kim had read, about the science project they were starting on butterflies. The words had tumbled out with an enthusiasm Marcus hadn't heard in months, and he'd listened with gratitude that felt almost painful in its intensity. The progress over subsequent weeks was visible in incremental changes that accumulated into transformation. Lily brought home drawings again, bright colors, smiling figures, her artistic expression recovering. She mentioned friends by name, asked if Maya could come for a play date, talked about school without dread. The trauma symptoms didn't vanish overnight. She still occasionally woke from nightmares, still apologized more than necessary, still showed sensitivity to raise voices. But the trajectory was clear. Healing was happening. Confidence was rebuilding. Joy was returning. 6 weeks after starting at Riverside, Lily was working on homework when the breakthrough came. She'd been attempting a math problem, gotten it wrong, and had frozen the old fear patterns surfacing. Marcus had seen her hands start to shake, had watched her eyes fill with tears. He'd knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "Hey, getting something wrong doesn't make you stupid. It means you're learning." "But Mrs. Hayes said," Marcus had taken her small hands in his. "Mrs. Hayes was wrong. She was the problem, not you. Do you understand that it wasn't your fault?" Lily had looked at him, and something had shifted in her expression. "It wasn't my fault. It was never your fault. You were 6 years old trying your best and an adult hurt you. That's on her, not you." The tears had come then, not frightened tears, but releasing tears, the dam breaking on months of internalized shame. Lily had sobbed into Marcus's shoulder, and he'd held her, letting her cry out the poison that Hayes had injected, giving her space to purge what never should have been there. When the crying subsided, Lily had pulled back to look at his face. "I'm not stupid. You're smart, capable, creative, and brave. Don't ever let anyone convince you otherwise." The transformation after that moment was like watching time-lapse photography of a flower blooming. Lily's confidence grew daily, visibly, measurably. She raised her hand in class at Riverside. She asked questions without fear. She tried new things without being paralyzed by potential failure. 3 months after the parking lot demonstration, Riverside Elementary held a holiday talent show. Lily had asked to participate, had chosen to sing, had selected a song that Marcus recognized as significant, "Brave," by Sarah Bareilles, with its lyrics about saying what you want to say and letting the words fall out. Marcus had sat in the audience surrounded by Rosa and Ghost and Doc and Bulldog, watching his daughter standing stage alone. She'd been nervous, hands shaking slightly, voice wavering at first, but she'd sung. She'd stood in front of hundreds of people and used her voice literally and metaphorically, choosing a song about bravery after learning what bravery costs. When she'd finished, Marcus had been crying openly, not caring who saw, not caring that tough bikers weren't supposed to cry in elementary school auditoriums. Ghost had put a hand on his shoulder, saying nothing, the gesture conveying everything. After the show, Lily had run to Marcus, her face glowing. "Was I brave, Daddy?" He'd lifted her into his arms despite her growing too big for it. "Braver than you know, sweetheart. I'm so proud of you." The changes had rippled beyond one family and one school. The story, 200 bikers demanding accountability for child abuse, had been picked up by national media. Major news networks had covered it, the footage of silent bikers standing in formation, playing against interviews with tearful parents, and articulate veterans explaining why they'd come. The narrative had resonated because it touched something universal: parents feeling powerless against institutions, the hope that collective action could force change, the image of tough men standing up for vulnerable children. Within weeks, the story had been shared millions of times across social media, had been featured on programs that reached demographics far beyond local news. Other communities began organizing. In Texas, parents demanded teacher accountability after bullying had been systematically ignored, and 50 bikers had shown up to support them. In Ohio, a coalition successfully pushed for removal of an administrator who'd covered up misconduct. In Florida, veterans groups partnered with PTAs to establish oversight of school disciplinary practices. The Hells Angels chapters nationwide took notice of how the story was resonating. Ghost was contacted by presidents from chapters across the country asking for guidance on partnering with child advocacy organizations. The Bikers Against Child Abuse program, which had existed in limited form for years, expanded dramatically as chapters recognized the power of organized presence in protecting children. Public perception shifted in ways that surprised even those who'd been there. The death's head patch that had made people cross the street became associated with protection and justice. Media coverages consistently emphasized that these weren't criminals but fathers, uncles, grandfathers, working men who cared deeply about child welfare and who'd found a way to leverage their collective presence for good. The Oregon legislature took up Lily's Law in January, a comprehensive student protection bill that strengthened mandatory reporting protocols, established oversight mechanisms for complaint handling, and allocated funding for mental health resources in schools. The bill passed with bipartisan support, and Governor signed it in a ceremony attended by Marcus Lilly, Angela Torres, David Park, and representatives from Voices for Safe Schools. The law was named for Lilly at the coalition's insistence over Marcus's protest that his daughter deserved privacy more than fame. But Angela had convinced him that attaching a name and a face to the legislation made it harder to ignore, made the cost of failure personal rather than abstract. At the signing ceremony, Lily stood beside the governor as he signed her hand resting on the bill that bore her name. She was 7 now, more confident than she'd been at 6, but still young enough that the significance wouldn't fully register for years. Marcus stood behind her, one hand on her shoulder, and thought about legacy, about how one father refusing to look away had created ripples that would protect children he'd never meet. 1 year after the parking lot demonstration, Pinewood Elementary held a dedication ceremony for a memorial garden. The school had been transformed under new principal leadership. Dr. Washington had transferred from Riverside to implement the reforms district-wide, and his approach emphasized student welfare with the same intensity Monroe had once devoted to test scores. The garden was small, tucked into a courtyard that had previously been unused space, but its meaning exceeded its size. A bronze plaque read, "For the children who suffered and the community that stood up, never again." Marcus attended with Lily, who'd been invited to place the first flower. She carried a sunflower chosen because it reminded her of the drawings she'd made in August before everything went dark, and planted it in the center bed with careful attention. Ghost and 20 other bikers attended in dress clothes rather than riding gear, standing respectfully as parents spoke about changes they'd witnessed healing that had begun children who were thriving now in environments that prioritized safety. Angela Torres spoke about Miguel, now 8, whose nightmares had stopped and whose love of learning had returned under new teachers trained in trauma-informed practices. David Park talked about his grandson, who transferred back to the district after Washington's reforms gave him confidence that mistakes wouldn't be repeated. When Marcus was invited to speak, he kept his remarks brief. "A year ago, I was just a dad who refused to accept his daughter's suffering as normal. Today, we're all part of something bigger. A reminder that systems change when people refuse to let them fail. Keep showing up. Keep demanding better. Keep protecting our kids." The real measure of success was visible in details too small for ceremony speeches. Lily now read aloud in class without fear. She raised her hand eagerly, not anxiously. She made mistakes and laughed about them rather than dissolving into panic. The child who'd been systematically broken had been carefully rebuilt stronger for having learned that adults would protect her, that speaking up mattered, that she was worth fighting for. That evening, Marcus and Lily maintained their Sunday tradition of making pancakes together. She stood on her step stool, measuring flour with concentration, while Marcus heated the griddle. The kitchen was warm, familiar, safe, exactly what home should feel like. Lily looked up from mixing batter. "Daddy," Maya's mom asked if you could teach her dad how to braid hair. Marcus smiled. "Sure, sweetheart. I'll send him the YouTube videos I used." "She said it's cool that you know how to do that not all dads learn." "Well, I had to learn. You needed your hair braided, and I'm your day, so I figured it out. Lily was quiet for a moment, stirring batter with methodical attention. Then, without looking up, Daddy, do you remember my old school with Mrs. Hayes? Marcus's hands stilled on the spatula. They talked about this in therapy, had processed it through Dr. Tran's careful guidance, but Lily rarely brought it up unprompted anymore. I remember, sweetheart. I'm glad you came that day. I'm glad you heard her. Me too. If something is ever wrong again, you'll come, right? You'll help. Marcus set down the spatula and knelt, bringing himself to her eye level. Always, no matter what, no matter where, if you need me, I'll be there. That's a promise I'll never break. Lily hugged him, sticky, batter-covered hands and all her small voice muffled against his shoulder. I know, Daddy. That's why I'm not scared anymore. After breakfast, Lily settled at the kitchen table with drawing supplies. Marcus watched as she worked her tongue, poking out slightly in concentration, choosing colors with deliberate care. When she finished, she held it up for his approval. The drawing showed a man and a girl on a motorcycle sunshine, overhead rainbow arcing across the sky, both figures smiling. In careful first-grade handwriting across the top, she'd written, "Me and my brave daddy." Marcus felt his throat constrict, tears threatening for what felt like the 1,000th time in the past year. That's beautiful, sweetheart. Can I keep it? It's for you, so you remember you're brave. He took the drawing, studying every detail, the care she'd taken with the rainbow colors, the way she'd drawn him larger than life but still gentle, the sunshine that suggested hope rather than threat. This was what healing looked like, a child who could create beauty again, who saw her father as protector rather than someone powerless to help. That night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus stood in his living room, looking at the two photographs side by side on the wall. His father in marine dress blues, frozen at 23, and beside it, Lily's drawing from today, two different generations, two different forms of protection, connected by the same lesson about standing up when standing up costs something. He thought about the past year, the parking lot full of motorcycles, the CPS investigation, the school board meetings, the policy changes, the national attention, the memorial garden. But more than any of that, he thought about Lily singing Brave on stage, about her planting the sunflower, about her standing on a stool making pancakes and chattering about friends and school without fear. Marcus pulled out his phone and texted Ghost, "Thank you, brother, for everything." The response came quickly. "That's what family does. How's Lily?" "Thriving, happy, healed." "Then we did good work." Marcus looked at his father's photograph again, at the young Marine who taught him about duty and honor, and protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He spoke aloud to the memory, to the lesson, to the legacy. "I hope I did right, Dad. I hope this was the way." The photograph offered no answer, but Marcus felt certainty settle in his chest anyway. His father had taught him that fear meant a moment mattered, and the question was whether you'd run or stand. Marcus had stood, his brothers had stood with him, and his daughter had learned the most important lesson of all. When you need help, people who love you will come, and standing up for what's right matters more than staying silent to avoid conflict. That was the legacy worth leaving. Not just the policy changes or the memorial garden or the law that bore Lily's name, but the understanding that one person refusing to accept wrong could inspire hundreds of others to find their voices. That systems changed when people demanded change. That children deserved adults who would fight for them. And that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was simply show up with 200 brothers if necessary and refuse to leave until someone answered for what they'd done. Marcus turned off the lights and checked on Lily one last time, watching her sleep peacefully in her bed, her stuffed rabbit tucked beside her, her breathing even and unlabored by nightmares. She was safe. She was healing. She knew she was loved. Everything else was detail. The war had been won not in the parking lot with motorcycles and media, but in these quiet moments, breakfast conversations, homework, help bedtime stories, the slow rebuilding of a child's understanding that the world could be safe and adults could be trusted. Tomorrow, Marcus would wake early and make breakfast and help Lily get ready for school. He'd pack her lunch with a yellow sticky note that said, "You're brave, you're smart, I love you." He'd drive her to Riverside Elementary where Miss Kim would greet her warmly and she'd run off to play with Maya without looking back. And that would be victory enough because that's what fathers did. That's what brotherhood meant. And that's what honor required, showing up every day for the people who needed you, building a world where children could be children, and where standing up for right mattered more than staying comfortable and wrong. Marcus closed Lily's door softly and returned to the living room where her drawing waited to be framed and hung beside his father's photograph. 3 generations of protection, each contributing to the legacy that would shape the next. The world his father had tried to build. The world Marcus had fought to preserve. The world Lily would inherit, knowing that her voice mattered and that adults would listen when she spoke. That was the story worth telling. That was the fight worth fighting, and that was the legacy that would endure long after the news cameras had moved on, and the motorcycles had returned to garages, and the memorial garden had grown wild with sunflowers.